Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Now, let's get started. Carmine Persico, born into the gritty streets of Brooklyn in 1933, wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. He wasn't loud, wasn't brash, and he certainly didn't chase after power in the way others did. While some looked for their chance to shine, Carmine was quietly observing, learning, and waiting. In a city where survival was often about the loudest voice or the strongest fist, Carmine knew that the true key to power was neither of those things. It was about control, patience, and being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Growing up, he wasn't much of a fighter or a troublemaker. Instead, Carmine studied the people around him, the way they walked, the way they spoke, the way they acted when they thought no one was looking. The young boy wasn't interested in the attention that came with being a tough guy. Instead, he made himself invisible, a quiet observer. And it was in this silence that Carmine learned the most important lesson of all: the real power in the world doesn't come from noise, but from the ability to operate unnoticed. In the tough, bustling streets of Brooklyn, you either learned how to keep quiet or you didn't survive. Carmine understood early on that if you stayed calm, if you stayed in the background, people wouldn't even notice you until it was too late. The other kids in his neighborhood would rush into trouble, shouting, fighting, and proving their strength in front of everyone. But Carmine? He stayed on the sidelines, making sure to read every situation before taking a step. It wasn't about being the loudest, it was about making your move at the right time. By the time he was a teenager, Carmine had already started to show what kind of man he would become. He joined a street gang, the Garfield Boys, but even then, he wasn't in a hurry to make himself known. He knew that being a part of the gang was just a way to get closer to the real action, learning how the bigger players in Brooklyn ran their operations. And he wasn't interested in petty theft or street fights. What he wanted was control. He wanted to learn how the world worked, who controlled the power, and how to make sure no one could touch him. While other kids would rush into the spotlight, Carmine took his time, learning from the shadows. His ability to watch, to wait, and to listen became his greatest strength. By the time he was in his 20s, Carmine had found his way into the world of the Prophesy family, a small but influential Mafia family in Brooklyn. Unlike the loud gangsters, Carmine never made a spectacle of himself. He was the quiet one, the one you wouldn't even notice unless you knew exactly what to look for. And those who did notice, they saw something different in him, a patience and a calmness that would eventually become his most dangerous weapon. Carmine wasn't looking for the title of boss. Not yet, anyway. What he wanted was influence, and that would take time. He wasn't the type to rush. So, he waited, watched, and built his network. He wasn't trying to be the most famous gangster or the most feared. He simply wanted to understand the game. And in understanding it, he would find a way to control it. Even in these early years, the seeds of Carmine's future power were already planted. While the others fought for attention, he stayed silent, always one step ahead. He didn't need to shout to make people listen. He knew that in the world he was moving through, those who made the least noise often held the most control. It was this quiet strategy that would eventually make him one of the most powerful men in Brooklyn, without ever raising his voice. As Carmine settled into life with the Prophesy family, it became clear that his path wasn't like the others around him. While the other men were chasing quick power, taking risks, and making noise, Carmine was taking the slow, steady route. He wasn't rushing to make his mark. Instead, he was building quietly, layer by layer, in the background. By the early 1950s, Carmine had become a trusted figure in the Prophesy organization. He wasn't a high-ranking member yet, but he was steadily gaining respect. The older men noticed something different about him. It wasn't just his calm demeanor or his intelligence, it was the way he understood the ebb and flow of power. He understood that control wasn't just about making deals or handling muscle. It was about timing, patience, and most importantly, knowing when to act. And Carmine acted only when he knew it would pay off. In 1959, the family faced a serious crisis when the Prophesy family leader, Joe Prophesy, became embroiled in internal tensions. Younger men within the family were starting to question the old guard's leadership. There were whispers of rebellion. The family was fractured, and a power struggle was beginning to unfold. Where others would have jumped into the fray, Carmine stayed calm. He knew that these kinds of conflicts could tear a family apart if not handled carefully. But he also knew that in times of crisis, opportunity was always lurking. Carmine did not take sides openly. He didn't rush to pick a faction. Instead, he quietly positioned himself as a neutral force, someone who could be trusted to mediate the dispute without getting too involved. This was his moment to show his true value. The rebel faction, led by Joe Gallo, was pushing hard for change, challenging Prophesie's leadership. Gallo wanted to reshape the family, make it more aggressive, more visible. But Carmine wasn't interested in flashiness or grand gestures. He saw the potential for chaos if Gallo succeeded. And while he didn't fully side with Prophesie, he also knew that Gallo's ambition could cause long-term damage. As the conflict escalated, Carmine quietly worked behind the scenes to broker peace, at least temporarily. He acted as a mediator, smoothing over conflicts, offering quiet advice to the family's leaders, and making sure that no one went too far. His ability to remain in the background and navigate the conflict without being noticed won him even more respect. People began to realize that Carmine wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist, someone who understood how to keep the peace when all around him was chaos. The rebellion fizzled out, but the lessons Carmine learned during this period stayed with him. He saw firsthand how fragile alliances could be, how quickly loyalty could shift, and how power could change hands in an instant. He understood that survival wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It was about being in control of the situation without anyone knowing you were the one pulling the strings. By the time Prophesie passed away in 1962, the family was in disarray. There was no clear successor. The family was divided between those loyal to Prophesie's widow, Joe Magliocco, and those who felt that the future of the family should be in the hands of someone with a more modern approach. Carmine wasn't interested in stepping into the spotlight right away, but it became increasingly clear that he was the one holding the family together. Magliocco's leadership, though official, was weak. He didn't have the support of all the family's key members. Carmine, ever patient, played his cards carefully. He made strategic alliances with other captains, gaining their trust without ever appearing to be chasing power. People began to see him as a natural leader, not because he sought the title, but because he was able to keep the family functioning while others scrambled for control. Carmine didn't take over the family immediately. He didn't need to. His approach was always about the long game. Over the next few years, he continued to work behind the scenes, building his influence in a way that was almost invisible. It was his calm, strategic approach that would eventually propel him to the top. He wasn't in a rush to declare himself boss. He understood that power was not about making bold, public statements, it was about making the right moves at the right time. In the early 1960s, Carmine wasn't just playing a role, he was becoming the unseen hand that guided the future of the Colombo family. By the time Joe Colombo, the figurehead of the family, emerged as the new boss in 1964, Carmine was already one of the most powerful men in the organization. But he remained in the shadows, allowing Colombo to take the public spotlight while he continued to work his strategy, making sure the family was positioned to survive whatever came next. By the mid-1960s, Carmine Persico's influence over the Colombo family was undeniable. While Joe Colombo had taken the public lead, Carmine's presence was felt behind the scenes. He wasn't the loudest, nor the most visible member of the family, but it was clear to those within the organization that the real power lay with him. Joe Colombo was more of a figurehead, his public role as a spokesperson for Italian-American rights gained him attention, but it was Carmine who kept the family's operations running smoothly. The tensions between the families were palpable. The old ways of doing business were being challenged by the new generation of mobsters who wanted faster results, more action, and bigger rewards. But Carmine understood something that many of these young men did not. Real power wasn't in making a loud entrance, it was in controlling the quiet moments, the ones that went unnoticed. He wasn't interested in chasing the spotlight. Instead, He focused on making sure that every aspect of the family's operation was working, quietly and efficiently, beneath the surface. As the 1970s rolled in, things began to change. The feds were tightening their grip on organized crime, using the RICO laws to break down entire criminal enterprises. The Colombo family, like the others, was starting to feel the heat. But Carmine, ever the strategist, had already anticipated the changes. He knew that survival wasn't just about maintaining the status quo, it was about evolving with the times. While Joe Colombo continued to focus on his public campaign for civil rights, Carmine took steps to protect the family's operations. He understood that the Mafia's old methods wouldn't last forever in the face of modern law enforcement techniques. And so, Carmine did what he had always done best: he adapted. He started using more secure methods of communication, relying less on face-to-face meetings and more on intermediaries. His ability to remain unseen, to communicate through trusted messengers, allowed him to maintain control even as the heat from the FBI grew more intense. But Carmine wasn't just focused on surviving the external pressure. He was also quietly consolidating his power within the family. In the background, he worked to secure his allies, ensuring that when the inevitable leadership shift occurred, he would be the one to take the reins. He didn't make moves that would draw attention to himself. Instead, he positioned himself as the silent leader, the one who was trusted to handle the most delicate situations. In 1971, Joe Colombo's assassination changed the course of the family's future. Colombo had been a public figure, but in the Mafia world, being visible often made you a target. His death left a void in the family's leadership, and Carmine knew that the time had come for him to step forward. However, he wasn't one for grand gestures. His rise to power wasn't marked by a bold move or a violent takeover. Instead, it was a slow, steady accumulation of influence. Carmine's strength lay in his ability to make others feel that he was the natural choice to lead, without ever having to say it out loud. As the family struggled with internal divisions, Carmine took his place at the top without ever having to force the issue. He didn't rush into the role; instead, he allowed the situation to unfold naturally. His ability to be patient and wait for the right moment had served him well, and now it was paying off. Those who had once doubted him now saw the wisdom in his approach. Carmine wasn't just another mobster looking for power, he was the one who understood how to keep the family alive in a world that was changing faster than anyone could keep up. In the 1970s and 1980s, Carmine solidified his grip on the Colombo family. Though he wasn't the flashiest leader, he was the one who knew how to make things run smoothly. He didn't need to be a figurehead or a public persona, he was the man who controlled everything behind the scenes. He was the one who made the tough decisions, the one who knew when to act and when to let things play out. His control was silent, but it was absolute. As law enforcement continued to put pressure on the family, Carmine's careful management became even more crucial. He avoided making any sudden moves that would draw attention, but he kept his hold on the family firm and ensured that it would survive, no matter the cost. His ability to stay calm in the face of mounting challenges was a testament to his understanding of the Mafia's inner workings. He was always several steps ahead of everyone else, and it was this foresight that allowed him to maintain control when so many others had fallen. In the midst of these challenges, Carmine's reputation grew. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was a master strategist, a man who understood that in the Mafia, the key to power was not in making noise, but in keeping things running smoothly from the shadows. His legacy, though quiet, was undeniable. It wasn't about his name on the front page of the newspapers, it was about the quiet dominance he held over the family, the way he guided it through some of its most difficult years. As the 1980s began, Carmine Persico's grip on the Colombo family had never been stronger. Even though he was officially incarcerated by then, serving his time behind the prison walls, Carmine had learned that the real power didn't need to be flaunted or claimed openly, it could be controlled from anywhere. The streets, the operations, the family businesses, everything still moved according to Carmine's silent instructions. The world outside had changed, but Carmine had anticipated it, adapted, and kept his hands on the wheel without anyone noticing. While most of the family members ran around trying to hold on to the old methods of organized crime, shakedowns, rackets, and violence, Carmine had long understood that the future of the Mafia wasn't in muscle. It was in staying out of sight, in making sure your connections remained unbreakable, and in using the law itself as a tool to protect the family. Through his careful planning, even from his prison cell, Carmine maintained the illusion of control. His influence was felt in every decision, in every move the family made. But it wasn't just about avoiding capture or staying in the background. Carmine's real genius was his ability to manipulate events so subtly that no one would ever suspect his hand in them. While the FBI tried to crack down on the Mafia using wiretaps and undercover agents, Carmine continued to stay a step ahead, moving his operations through intermediaries and using coded messages. He had learned early on that in this game, silence was just as effective as force. Despite the strategies he'd put into place, not everyone in the family was content with the way things were. The younger men, including figures like Victor Little Vic Orena, began to grow restless. They wanted more control, more action, more power. Orena, a charismatic leader, felt that Carmine's silent, behind-the-scenes style of leadership wasn't the future of the family. He wanted to be in the spotlight, to be the face of the family's operations. Tensions began to rise, and the family started to fracture. While Orena's faction grew bolder, Carmine kept his calm. The last thing he would do was rush into a power struggle. He understood that conflicts like this were bound to happen. Ambitious young men wanted their share of the pie, and that was always going to create tension. So, he bided his time, watching closely as Orena tried to make his move. Carmine didn't need to engage in a fight right away. He knew that Orena's support would eventually splinter, and when it did, Carmine would be there to pick up the pieces, ready to assert his control once again. By the early 1990s, the battle for leadership within the Colombo family had escalated into what would come to be known as the Second Colombo War. It was a brutal conflict, with families divided, loyalties tested, and bloodshed in the streets. Orena's followers clashed with Carmine's, and for a time, it seemed like a complete breakdown was inevitable. But through all of it, Carmine's influence remained. His men fought for him, not because they were afraid, but because they knew he was the one who could hold the family together, even in the midst of chaos. Carmine, though physically removed from the battle, was still at the center of it all. He controlled everything from his prison cell. His orders were passed through trusted lieutenants, his allies worked in the shadows to undermine Orena's faction, and slowly but surely, Carmine's grip on the family began to tighten once more. While Orena's faction was divided and weakened by the war, Carmine's leadership proved to be unshakable. The war ended in Carmine's favor. Orena was pushed out, his followers scattered or eliminated. Once again, Carmine's quiet dominance had triumphed. But the victory wasn't without cost. The family, though still loyal to Carmine, was fractured. The years of infighting had left scars that would never fully heal. Carmine had won the battle, but he knew the war for control, both within his family and within the larger world of organized crime, was far from over. As the 1990s wore on, Carmine continued to exert his influence, even though the Mafia itself was weakening. The FBI's efforts to dismantle the Mafia were more relentless than ever, and younger men who had been raised on the old code were beginning to question whether the family's operations were worth the risk. The world was changing, and Carmine, though still at the top, knew that the old ways couldn't survive forever. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that his family, his legacy, would endure. His methods, his patience, and his ability to control from behind the scenes would ensure that. Even as the Mafia landscape shifted, Carmine remained a symbol of the old guard, someone who had seen it all, who had survived it all, and who had made sure that his family could weather the storm. The world had changed, but Carmine's influence remained as powerful as ever. By the time the 1990s arrived, Carmine Persico's role in the Mafia world had become a quiet myth. His name was no longer in the headlines, and his face was rarely seen in public. But those who knew him, those who understood the true mechanics of the underworld, knew that he was still pulling the strings. Even as his physical presence diminished, his influence continued to loom large. While the FBI and other law enforcement agencies had grown more sophisticated in their efforts to dismantle organized crime, Carmine had already anticipated these changes. His survival instinct was second to none, and he had learned how to adapt in ways that others couldn't. But even as Carmine navigated the changing landscape, the tension within his family continued to simmer. The younger generation, emboldened by the more aggressive tactics of their time, wanted more than Carmine could offer. They wanted fast money, more control, and greater visibility. They didn't have the patience Carmine had once had, and they certainly didn't understand the value of operating from the shadows. To them, the quiet, strategic approach of the past felt outdated, even weak. They didn't see the value in subtlety or waiting for the right moment. They wanted to act now, make their mark, and take whatever power they could seize. But Carmine knew better. He had spent his life learning that true power was never about immediate gains. It was about survival, about outlasting your enemies, about understanding that empires were built on steady, consistent control. He understood that while the Mafia world had changed, some things, like patience and strategy, would always be crucial. What mattered now wasn't flashy power plays but making sure that the family stayed intact, that it survived the new world of organized crime. By the time the mid-90s rolled around, Carmine had already begun preparing for his eventual exit, though he didn't show it publicly. He had lived through so many phases of the Mafia that he knew how this story would end. The world was changing, and the Mafia, too, was beginning to show signs of age. New players, new forms of crime, and new technology were all shifting the dynamics that had once made the mob what it was. Yet, Carmine was not afraid of change. He embraced it, knowing that his empire would never be the same, but he was confident it could still survive. He had spent decades building alliances and positioning his family to withstand the pressures of the modern world. While others panicked, Carmine maintained the same quiet control he always had. Even as law enforcement seemed to close in on him, and the federal government ramped up its efforts to dismantle the five families, Carmine continued to play the game. From his prison cell, he remained a key figure in the operations of the Colombo family, pulling the strings through intermediaries. The old days of sitting at a table in a back room and plotting the family's future were gone, but Carmine had found new ways to communicate with his loyalists. He knew how to use the law and the system to his advantage. But as the years passed, Carmine began to feel the weight of age and time. His health was declining. The once strong man was no longer the force he had been in his youth. Yet, even in his weakened state, his mind remained sharp, and his control over the family was still evident. He may not have been able to physically lead the family anymore, but his influence never waned. He had taught his loyalists everything they needed to know about survival, and they would carry his methods with them long after he was gone. In these later years, Carmine's true legacy became apparent, not just in the family's operations, but in how the younger generation had been shaped by him. He had raised them to think long-term, to prioritize survival, and to never be caught up in the rush of fleeting power. Those who had learned from him understood the value of patience, and they understood that running a family wasn't about grabbing for power but about ensuring its survival. Carmine's family would continue, but it would be different. It wouldn't be the same street-based empire he had once built, but it would endure because of the foundations he had laid. And so, as the 2000s approached and Carmine's health continued to deteriorate, he could rest easy knowing that the principles he had instilled in his family would carry them forward. He had fought, not just for power, but for survival, and in the end, that had been his greatest victory. Carmine may have been fading, but his legacy was secure. As Carmine's health began to decline, he found himself in a position he had never anticipated. A man who had spent his entire life controlling his environment, dictating the movements of those around him, now found that his most powerful tool, his mind, was the only thing he had left. His body had weakened with age, and the relentless pressures of time had caught up with him. But Carmine had always been a man of quiet strength, and now more than ever, he needed to rely on that inner resolve. Even as his physical capabilities diminished, Carmine's presence in the Mafia world remained strong. His control, though indirect, was still absolute. Those who had been loyal to him for decades, those who understood his methods, kept things running as he had taught them. The family's operations continued smoothly, without disruption, despite the challenges they faced from law enforcement and the younger generation's increasing impatience. The world had changed, but the principles Carmine had instilled were timeless. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the Mafia faced its greatest threat yet, a full-scale war against law enforcement. The FBI and other federal agencies had launched a series of major operations targeting the families, using the RICO Act to bring down entire networks of organized crime. Carmine had seen it all before. The law always came knocking, but he had always been able to adapt and survive. This time, however, things were different. The pressure from law enforcement was relentless, and even Carmine's careful methods couldn't stop the inevitable collapse of the old ways. As the family dealt with increasing interference from federal agencies, Carmine's role became more symbolic. He was the old guard, the unseen figurehead, and the respect he commanded was as much about what he represented as it was about his actual control. Those who worked for him had grown up under his leadership and had been shaped by his quiet strength. But the younger generation, raised in a world where power was more about who could be the loudest and most visible, began to lose respect for the old ways. They wanted to move faster, make more money, and grab more power, all in the name of modernizing the family business. Still, Carmine's legacy remained untouchable. Even though his power was no longer immediate, his methods continued to be the foundation of how the family operated. The calm, methodical approach to decision-making, the ability to wait patiently for the right moment, and the emphasis on strategic alliances were all lessons that the younger members of the family would have to carry forward. Carmine had created the blueprint for survival, and no matter how much the world around him changed, that blueprint would endure. But Carmine's health continued to decline, and he knew his time was running out. It wasn't just his age or the physical toll of his life, it was the weight of all the years he had spent in the shadows, holding the family together with nothing but his quiet, steady control. The toll was inevitable. In his final years, as the world continued to change around him, Carmine began to think more about his legacy than about his immediate power. He knew that the family couldn't survive in its current form. The old world of the Mafia was gone, replaced by a new era where technology, globalization, and modern law enforcement tactics made the old ways of doing business obsolete. Carmine's empire, though still strong, couldn't keep up with the changes in the outside world. The younger generation may have been impatient, but they would have to find a way to adapt or risk being left behind. Carmine had always believed in the survival of the fittest, and while his time at the top had passed, he knew the family could still endure if it evolved. His final years were spent quietly, advising those closest to him and making sure that the values he had instilled in the family, the value of patience, of survival, of quiet strength, would carry on after he was gone. He had lived through the rise and fall of so many figures in the criminal world, and now, as his own legacy neared its end, he was preparing the next generation to carry the torch. Carmine's death wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't the violent end that many would have expected for a figure like him. Instead, it was a quiet passing, in a prison cell, surrounded by the men who had known him best. But even in death, his influence remained, a silent force in the underworld. The men who had been shaped by his leadership would continue to lead, and the lessons he had taught them would continue to guide them. Carmine's legacy was never about violence or fame, it was about control, patience, and surviving in a world that was constantly shifting beneath your feet. And so, as Carmine passed, the Mafia world moved forward. It was a world that had changed drastically from the one he had known, but his influence would always linger, quietly shaping the decisions of those who followed. Carmine Persico may have left this world, but his mark would never fade, because true power wasn't in being seen, it was in being remembered. After Carmine Persico passed, his absence left a vacuum, but it didn't create chaos. The organization he had built over decades continued to move forward, albeit with a different rhythm. The world around them had changed. The Mafia that once ruled the streets with violence and intimidation was now fighting a new battle, survival in an age of digital surveillance, relentless law enforcement, and a generation of young men who viewed the Mafia as a fading relic. But even in death, Carmine remained a figure to be reckoned with. He had designed the blueprint for survival, and the men who followed him, those who had learned from his quiet strength, knew that the game was far from over. Carmine's death didn't mark the end of the Colombo family's power, it only signaled a new era of challenges. Though the younger generation had grown up in a different world, one driven by technology and fast money, they still remembered the lessons Carmine had instilled. His teachings were subtle yet enduring: control, patience, adaptability, traits that were timeless in the world of organized crime. His legacy, though quiet, was still a guiding force. His quiet presence in the family wasn't replaced by a single man, but by a collective understanding of how things should be run. The family tried to navigate the new reality that came after Carmine's death. But the tensions within the Colombo family began to grow as the younger generation struggled to figure out how to maintain the power that had once been Carmine's. The old methods were no longer enough to keep the family afloat. The younger men wanted more. They wanted to be seen, to take risks, to grab the power that seemed to be slipping away. They wanted to be in the spotlight, something Carmine had never needed. But even as the family struggled with this shift, they still held on to Carmine's vision. Even in death, his influence was still felt in the way the family operated. The lessons he had taught were embedded in their actions. Even though the family was fractured by new ambitions, there was an underlying respect for the quiet, calculated power that Carmine had once wielded. It was this respect that held the family together when it might have otherwise fallen apart. However, the new generation's impatience with the old ways couldn't be ignored forever. As the family grew more divided, the younger members, fueled by ambition and the desire to step out from Carmine's shadow, began to push back. They started to challenge the old ways, wanting faster action, quicker rewards, and a break from the careful, patient strategy that Carmine had championed. They saw the world moving at an unprecedented pace, and they didn't want to be left behind. The struggle between the old guard and the new blood continued to simmer. The young men in the family wanted to carve out their own legacies. They didn't want to be seen as living in Carmine's shadow. They were eager to show their worth, to prove that they could take the family into a new era. But they didn't realize that the quiet control Carmine had exercised was more effective than the fast-paced tactics they were advocating for. Yet, Carmine's passing left a void that no one could fill. His role as the silent architect of the family's power was irreplaceable. Those who had followed him didn't just lose a boss, they lost a mentor, someone who had shown them how to survive when everyone else was struggling to stay afloat. As the years passed, the influence of Carmine's methods began to fade, replaced by new, faster, and sometimes more dangerous approaches. The world had changed, and the Mafia was no longer the same institution it had been in Carmine's time. But his legacy was undeniable. In many ways, he had taught his family the most important lesson of all, that the key to survival wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest, it was about being the smartest, the most patient, and the most adaptable. Though the Mafia world had grown quieter, less visible, and more fractured, Carmine Persico's name still carried weight. Even as the family and the Mafia as a whole navigated the shifting tides of modernity, they continued to operate under the silent teachings of the man who had seen it all. His reign had ended, but his influence was still present, hidden in the strategies, the decisions, and the quiet moments that defined the family's survival. As the 2000s unfolded, the world around the Colombo family grew quieter, but the undercurrent of tension never disappeared. Though Carmine Persico's name was no longer one that dominated the headlines, his legacy loomed large over the family. It wasn't just his decisions that had shaped their survival, it was his quiet influence, the manner in which he ran things from behind the scenes. Even in his absence, his teachings about patience, control, and strategic thinking continued to echo within the ranks of those who had once worked for him. The world of organized crime had shifted. The old days of muscle and brute force were now long gone. Carmine's era had been one where discretion and planning meant more than fast action and loud dominance. But the younger generation that had risen in his wake couldn't seem to understand this. They were hungry for immediate gratification, eager to assert themselves, and desperate for a piece of the limelight. The slow, patient style of leadership that had once made Carmine such a powerful figure seemed outdated to them. They wanted quick returns, visible power, and control of their own. The Mafia world, they thought, needed to modernize. But the younger generation was mistaken. They didn't understand the value of being unseen, of being the silent force that moved things along without drawing attention. Carmine had mastered that art. His leadership was built on subtlety. He had never needed to be the loudest or the most violent. Instead, he had been the one who quietly guided things in the right direction, who made sure that the family's operation ran smoothly without the public knowing who was truly in charge. This was something that the new men didn't grasp. They were quick to act, to rise up, to challenge authority, but they were missing the point. The Mafia wasn't built on fast actions, it was built on survival. As the years passed, law enforcement's attention on the Mafia only grew stronger. The FBI, armed with even more advanced technology and a growing network of informants, put increasing pressure on the families. It was no longer just about taking down the leaders, it was about dismantling entire criminal networks. For Carmine, this had always been inevitable. He had seen the signs for years. The Mafia's old ways, its reliance on physical power and territorial control, were being replaced by new methods. But he had known how to survive, how to adjust to the changes. The younger men, though, they didn't have the patience to play the long game. They rushed into deals, took risks they didn't fully understand, and made enemies they couldn't afford. The family, once a force to be reckoned with, began to show signs of strain. Its operations were no longer as clean or as efficient as they once had been. The younger men's ambition often outweighed their ability to think through the consequences, and slowly, the cracks began to show. But Carmine's influence still hung over the family, even in death. The men who had learned from him were still there, operating quietly, making sure the family didn't collapse entirely. Even when the family struggled, they knew to fall back on Carmine's teachings. It was about survival. Despite their impatience and desire for immediate power, the younger generation had no choice but to respect the methods Carmine had instilled. They might have resented the quiet, slow-moving nature of his leadership, but they couldn't ignore the fact that Carmine had known how to outlast everyone. His patience, his ability to wait for the right moment, his skill in controlling the most delicate situations without ever being noticed, that was what had kept the family alive. In the end, it wasn't the loudest or the most violent who survived. It was those who could adapt, those who could evolve with the changing times, while still holding on to the principles that had kept them afloat. Carmine had built the family on adaptability. The Mafia world had changed, but his legacy, his quiet influence, was still alive in those who remembered how to make decisions without being seen. His death hadn't marked the end of the Colombo family, it had simply marked the beginning of a new chapter. The new leaders, those who had grown up in the shadow of Carmine's greatness, knew that to survive in this new world, they would need to understand the lessons he had taught them. The lessons of patience, control, and the quiet power of strategic thinking. They might have been impatient for change, but they would ultimately have to face the reality that Carmine had known all along: survival was the real game. And in that game, it was never about being the loudest. It was about being the one who was still standing when everything else had fallen. By the early 2000s, the Mafia landscape had transformed dramatically. The power that had once been held by figures like Carmine Persico was no longer as absolute. The families, though still present, were no longer the all-powerful entities they had once been. Law enforcement had adapted to the Mafia's old ways and had become more effective, using technology and informants to break down criminal organizations from the inside out. Yet, despite all of this, Carmine's influence continued to be felt. Even though he was gone, the blueprint he had created for survival within the Mafia world was still being followed. The young men, eager for their own power, had grown restless, but they didn't realize they were still following the principles Carmine had taught. His methods had always been about adaptation, about understanding when to strike and when to wait. The Mafia world, though changing, still operated under the same basic principles Carmine had relied on for so many years. His legacy of control had seeped into the core of the Colombo family. Carmine had never believed in rushing into things. Unlike the brash, impulsive younger generation that was often too eager to prove themselves, Carmine had built his empire with patience and precision. He knew that to hold power in this world, you didn't need to be the loudest or most visible. You needed to be the one who could operate in the shadows, who understood how to survive the inevitable rise and fall of the Mafia. And that lesson, more than any other, became Carmine's true legacy. As the Colombo family struggled to stay relevant in this new world, the younger men, though still loyal to Carmine's methods, were becoming frustrated. They wanted to make moves that were bolder, that would give them a sense of immediate success. But the Mafia, as Carmine had understood, was no longer about the big, flashy moves. It was about surviving the system, outlasting the constant pressure, and quietly staying in control. But there were complications. The new generation's desire for instant power, mixed with the growing influence of law enforcement and changing criminal activities, made it harder for the family to maintain its grip. Though Carmine had made sure to lay the groundwork for survival, there were cracks appearing in the foundation. The world outside was no longer what it had been when Carmine first rose to power. The digital age had arrived, and the Mafia could no longer operate in the shadows as they had in the past. Despite these challenges, there were still those who remembered Carmine's wisdom, those who had been loyal to him through thick and thin. They understood that even in a changing world, patience and strategy still mattered. They kept the family alive through quiet, deliberate actions, never rushing, always calculating. As time went on, however, it became clear that the world Carmine had known was gone. The influence of the Mafia was no longer what it had been, and even those who had been raised under Carmine's guidance began to realize that the game was changing too fast for them to keep up. The younger men, eager for power, wanted more than just survival. They wanted to dominate, to be seen. And though they had learned Carmine's lessons, they were beginning to see that those lessons weren't enough to keep them in control forever. In his final years, Carmine had seen the writing on the wall. He knew that the family he had helped to build, the empire he had created, couldn't last forever in its old form. The world was changing, and the Mafia, as it had once been, couldn't survive the modern age. But he also knew that survival wasn't about holding on to the old ways. It was about evolving, about finding new ways to keep control in a world that seemed to be turning against them. Carmine's influence continued to live on in the decisions of those who followed him. Even as the Mafia world began to fade, the lessons he had taught about survival, control, and patience remained central to the way the family operated. Though the family wasn't what it used to be, and though the younger generation had lost some of the old respect, Carmine's methods continued to guide them. His legacy was undeniable, not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it was built to last. The enduring silence of Carmine Persico, the way he had controlled without ever being seen, had shaped the Mafia world in ways that no one else could replicate. He had created an empire not through brute force, but through patience and strategic thinking. And though the world around the Colombo family had changed, the lessons he left behind ensured that the family would never completely fade away. As the years passed after Carmine Persico's death, the world around him continued to change. The rise of new players, new forms of crime, and relentless law enforcement pressure marked the decline of the traditional Mafia families. What Carmine had once built, the system of quiet power, patience, and strategic control, was now a distant memory. Yet, despite the changes, his legacy never fully faded. It lingered in the way the younger generation still tried to emulate his methods, even if they didn't always fully understand them. By the time the 2010s arrived, the Mafia as it had once existed was no longer the dominant force in the criminal world. Law enforcement, using new technology and more aggressive tactics, had systematically dismantled the networks that had once ruled the streets. The Colombo family, like the others, had been forced to adapt, but adapting wasn't the same as thriving. Many of the older members of the family had either passed away or were serving lengthy prison sentences, and the younger men were increasingly unable to uphold the values that Carmine had instilled. Carmine's old methods, stealth, silence, and strategic patience, no longer had the same effect in a world where everything moved at lightning speed. The new generation wanted results fast. They were more willing to take risks and make loud moves to show their dominance. But that came at a cost. The old codes that Carmine had built the family on were being eroded, and without those foundations, the family struggled to maintain its relevance. But there were still those who remembered Carmine's teachings. The few who had worked closely with him or had inherited his understanding of control, those who knew that real power was still in patience and quiet strength, continued to keep the family from completely disintegrating. Though they were fewer in number, they operated as a close-knit unit, relying on the principles Carmine had taught them. They didn't seek the spotlight, but they kept the family afloat by sticking to the old ways, operating from the shadows where they knew they were safe. In the years leading up to the end of the 2010s, the Mafia world, while still present, became more fragmented and increasingly less influential. The younger men, who had tried to force their vision of what the Mafia should be, began to realize that the world they had inherited wasn't built for the kinds of power plays they wanted. Technology had made the streets more dangerous for anyone involved in organized crime. Surveillance, wiretaps, and data collection meant that the shadowy world Carmine had navigated so expertly was now exposed. The loud, flashy power grabs they had embraced only led them into law enforcement's radar, and soon, many of them were arrested or sidelined. But still, Carmine's legacy lived on. The younger generation may not have followed his exact methods, but they couldn't escape the fact that the quiet control he had exercised was the key to surviving in a world that no longer tolerated the old ways of doing business. Even in the face of a changing world, those who respected him understood that there was still wisdom in waiting, in thinking long-term, and in making sure your moves were precise and calculated. In the end, the story of Carmine Persico wasn't just one of rise and fall, it was a story of survival. He had outlived his rivals, the changing tides of organized crime, and even the law itself. His reign had never been flashy, but it had been effective. The world had shifted, but the principles he had adhered to, patience, strategic thinking, and control, were timeless. His story was not one of dramatic victories, but of quiet resilience. He understood that in this world, it wasn't always the loudest who won, it was the ones who could adapt and wait. Carmine Persico, the man who had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, ended up being one of the most influential figures in the history of the Colombo family. His legacy was more than just the empire he built, it was in the quiet ways he showed his family how to survive when everything else was falling apart. And though the world around the family changed, Carmine's teachings about patience and control would never fade. The lessons he left behind would continue to shape the world of organized crime, even as the Mafia itself faded into the background of history. The snake had slithered into the past, but his presence was still felt, quietly and powerfully, in the shadows. If you've enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through Carmine Persico's life and legacy.